September 1994, Radio City Music Hall, New York City. The legendary venue was packed with 18,000 fans who had waited months for this moment. Whitney Houston's The Bodyguard World Tour was at its absolute peak, and tonight was being filmed for a television special that would air to millions around the world. The energy in the historic theater was electric, almost tangible, as fans from every corner of America had gathered to witness the voice of a generation perform live. Whitney had already delivered powerhouse performances of I Wanna Dance with Somebody and How Will I Know, and the crowd was on their feet for every note. But nobody in that building could have predicted what was about to happen during I Will Always Love You, as the opening piano notes of her most iconic ballad filled the ornate theater. Something unusual caught Whitney's attention in the front row. A teenage girl with dark glasses and a white cane was holding up a folded piece of paper with trembling hands. The girl's mother stood beside her, tears already streaming down her face, desperately trying to get Whitney's attention. Security guards moved to stop them, assuming this was just another overeager fan trying to disrupt the show. But there was something about the girl's face, something about the way she was reaching out not with her eyes, but with her entire being, that made Whitney pause mid-verse. The orchestra continued playing, but Whitney's voice had stopped. She stood frozen on stage, microphone in hand, staring at this blind teenager who was holding that paper like it contained the most important message in the world. The confusion rippled through the audience as people began to whisper and wonder why the greatest voice of their generation had suddenly gone silent. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, and at 16 years old, she had never seen a sunrise, never watched a movie, never looked into her mother's eyes. Sarah had been born completely blind due to a rare genetic condition called Leber's congenital amaurosis, a disease that destroyed the light-receiving cells in her retinas before she even took her first breath. For 16 years, Sarah had navigated a world of darkness, relying on sound, touch, and an extraordinary ability to visualize through audio. And in that world of perpetual night, Whitney Houston's voice had become her light. Sarah's mother, Sarah Jenkins, was a single parent who worked 2 jobs as a nurse's aide in Brooklyn just to make ends meet. Money was always tight, and luxuries like concert tickets were completely out of reach. But Sarah had never asked for much. She never complained about not being able to see the things other teenagers saw. She never expressed bitterness about her condition. The only thing Sarah ever truly wanted was to hear Whitney Houston sing live, to be in the same room with the voice that had given color to her colorless world. When Sarah was 5 years old, I played Greatest Love of All for her during a particularly difficult day, Patricia recalled years later. She had just come home from a doctor's appointment where they confirmed there was no surgery that could restore her vision. She was devastated, crying in a way that broke my heart. But when Whitney's voice came through the speakers, Sarah stopped crying. She tilted her head like she was seeing something for the first time. She told me, "Mama, I can see her voice. It has colors." From that moment on, Whitney's music became Sarah's way of experiencing beauty. She would describe I Will Always Love You as deep purple with threads of gold running through it. I Wanna Dance with Somebody was bright yellow with splashes of orange. Greatest Love of All was soft blue, like the sky her mother described to her. Through Whitney's voice, Sarah created an entire visual universe that existed only in her mind, but was more real to her than anything sighted people could see with their eyes. When Patricia heard that Whitney would be performing at Radio City Music Hall, she knew this might be Sarah's only chance to experience her hero live. The problem was the tickets. Even the cheapest seats were $200, and Patricia was already behind on rent. She had been saving for months to afford a crucial surgery that might partially restore Sarah's vision, an experimental procedure that cost $30,000. They had managed to save $11,000 through years of sacrifice, and every dollar mattered. But when Sarah found out about the concert, she made a decision that devastated her mother. She asked Patricia to use the surgery money to buy tickets, not cheap seats in the back, but the best seats they could afford, as close to Whitney as possible. Patricia tried to explain that this money represented years of hope, the possibility that Sarah might one day see her face. But Sarah's response was simple and heartbreaking. "Mama, I've lived 16 years in darkness. I'm okay with that. But if I die tomorrow without hearing Whitney Houston sing in person, I'll regret it forever. Her voice is the only thing I've ever wanted to see more clearly. Against every instinct, against every piece of maternal wisdom, Patricia took $3,000 from the surgery fund and bought 2 front-row tickets to Whitney Houston's concert. As she held those tickets in her hands, she cried, knowing she had just postponed her daughter's chance at sight by at least another year. But she also knew that sometimes seeing isn't just about eyes. Sometimes it's about experiencing something so profound that it changes your soul forever. The night before the concert, Sarah stayed up until dawn writing a letter to Whitney. She had her mother help her write it because Sarah had learned Braille, not standard written English. The letter explained everything: her blindness, how Whitney's music had given her a way to see beauty, and the sacrifice her mother had made to bring her to this concert. But the last paragraph was what would ultimately stop Whitney Houston in her tracks. Sarah had written, "Miss Houston, my mama gave up my chance to see with my eyes so I could hear you with my heart. I will never regret this choice. Your voice is the only miracle I've ever needed. Thank you for teaching a blind girl how to see." As Whitney Houston stood frozen on the Radio City Music Hall stage, staring at the blind girl holding up the letter, time seemed to stop for everyone in that historic theater. The orchestra, confused by Whitney's sudden silence, gradually stopped playing. The string section's final notes hung in the air like a question mark. 18,000 people collectively held their breath, wondering if something was wrong with their idol. Was she sick? Had she forgotten the lyrics? Was this part of the show? Karen Miller, Whitney's tour manager, immediately spoke through her earpiece. "Whitney, what's happening? Are you okay? Should we restart the song?" But Whitney didn't respond. She was completely focused on the girl in the front row, whose trembling hands still held that piece of paper like it was the most precious thing in the world. Whitney walked slowly to the edge of the stage, each step deliberate, her sequined gown catching the spotlight and throwing fragments of light across the audience. Security guards tensed, ready to intervene if this was some kind of disruption. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Whitney asked, her voice soft but amplified through the wireless microphone she still held. The question carried throughout the entire venue, and the crowd leaned forward collectively, trying to understand what was happening. Sarah Jenkins, who had been nervous to the point of shaking, felt her mother's hand squeeze her shoulder for encouragement. "Sarah," the girl replied, her voice barely audible even though she was in the front row. "Sarah Jenkins, Miss Houston." Whitney knelt down at the edge of the stage, bringing herself closer to eye level with the teenager. It was then that Whitney noticed the white cane leaning against Sarah's seat and the dark glasses that didn't quite hide the way Sarah's eyes didn't focus on any particular point. Whitney's expression changed from confusion to understanding, and everyone who was close enough to see her face later said they watched something transform in that moment. "Sarah, are you holding something for me?" Whitney asked gently. Sarah nodded and extended the letter with both hands, the way someone might offer a precious gift. A security guard moved to intercept it, protocol dictating that nothing should be handed directly to the performer, but Whitney held up her hand to stop him. "Let her give it to me," Whitney said firmly. She reached down and took the letter directly from Sarah's hands. As their fingers touched, Sarah gasped audibly. Later, she would describe that moment as feeling electricity pass between them, a connection that transcended physical sight. Whitney stood up and, with the entire audience watching in complete silence, began to unfold the letter. The house lights came up slightly so she could read, and the massive video screens throughout the theater showed Whitney's face as her eyes moved across the page. The audience watched her expression change as she read, first curious, then surprised, then deeply moved. When she reached the final paragraph about Sarah's mother sacrificing the surgery money for concert tickets, Whitney's hand went to her mouth and her eyes filled with tears. The cameramen filming for the television special captured every second, not knowing they were documenting what would become one of the most powerful moments in concert history. Whitney read the letter twice, and by the second reading, tears were streaming down her face, cutting tracks through her stage makeup. Backstage, her mother, Sissy Houston, who had come to watch the performance, felt her own eyes welling up, even though she didn't know yet what was written on that paper. When Whitney finally looked up from the letter, She wasn't looking at 18,000 fans anymore. She was looking at one blind girl who had taught her something profound about the real power of music. Whitney's voice, when she finally spoke, was thick with emotion and barely controlled grief. "Sarah wrote me a letter," Whitney said to the audience, her voice cracking. "She's 16 years old and she's never seen a single thing in her entire life. Not her mother's face, not a sunset, not anything. But she told me that my music taught her how to see." Whitney paused, trying to compose herself enough to continue. Her mama, bless her heart, took money they'd been saving for an operation that might restore Sarah's vision, and she bought tickets to this show instead. Because Sarah told her that hearing me sing in person was more important than seeing with her eyes. The audience gasped collectively. Throughout the theater, people began crying. Mothers clutched their daughters tighter. Fathers felt their throats close with emotion. This wasn't just a concert anymore. This was something sacred. Whitney Houston stood on that stage holding Sarah Jenkins's letter, and something inside her cracked open. Here she was, at the peak of her career, having just starred in the biggest movie of the year, with the best-selling soundtrack of all time. She had fame, fortune, and the adoration of millions. But in that moment, none of it mattered compared to the sacrifice a single mother had made and the faith a blind girl had in the power of music. "Sarah," Whitney said, looking directly at the girl even though she knew Sarah couldn't see her. "Will you come up here with me, baby? Will you come up on this stage?" Sarah's mother, Patricia, looked uncertain. This wasn't what they had expected. They had just wanted to give Whitney the letter, to thank her, not to become part of the show. But Whitney was insistent. "Please, Sarah, I need you up here with me." With her mother's guidance and the help of security staff, Sarah made her way to the stage stairs. The audience watched in absolute silence as the blind teenager, using her white cane, carefully climbed the steps. When she reached the stage, Whitney walked over and took her hand, leading her to center stage. The two of them stood there together under the spotlight. And the contrast was striking. Whitney in her glamorous gown, Sarah in a simple dress that Patricia had sewn herself because store-bought clothes were a luxury they couldn't afford. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitney announced to the crowd, "we're going to do something different tonight. Sarah is going to help me sing I Will Always Love You, and I want you all to understand something important. This girl has given up her chance at sight to be here tonight. She chose music over miracles. So, we're going to give her the performance of a lifetime." But what Whitney said next shocked everyone in the building, including her own management team and the television producers who were filming. "And then we're going to make sure Sarah gets that surgery, because nobody should have to choose between hearing music and seeing the world. Night. All proceeds from this show are going to Sarah's medical fund." Backstage, Whitney's tour manager practically choked. This was a televised concert with complex financial arrangements involving the venue, the network, sponsors, and Whitney's record label. You couldn't just arbitrarily redirect revenue like that. But Whitney didn't care about logistics or contracts or corporate complications. She had made a decision from the heart, and nothing was going to change her mind. The audience erupted in applause so thunderous that it shook the historic theater. People weren't just clapping. They were standing, crying, and cheering for the humanity they were witnessing. This wasn't about entertainment anymore. This was about something far more important. Whitney guided Sarah to stand beside the grand piano that sat center stage. "Sarah, honey, I want you to feel the music, okay? I'm going to sing, and I want you to tell me what colors you see." She then turned to her musical director and said something that would require completely rearranging the performance. "We're starting over. From the top. And we're doing it acoustic, just piano and voice." As the pianist began the gentle opening notes of I Will Always Love You, Whitney kept one hand on Sarah's shoulder, connecting them physically so Sarah could feel every breath Whitney took, every vibration of her voice. When Whitney began to sing, something magical happened in that theater. Sarah's face transformed. The nervousness disappeared, replaced by a look of pure transcendence. As Whitney's voice soared through the opening verse, Sarah began to cry, but they were tears of joy. When Whitney reached the first powerful chorus, Sarah's mouth opened in awe, and she reached out her hands as if she could touch the notes floating through the air. "What color is it, Sarah?" Whitney asked between verses, genuinely curious. Sarah's answer was immediate and certain. "Purple and gold, Miss Houston. Deep purple like velvet, with threads of gold running through it. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Whitney's voice cracked with emotion, but she kept singing. The audience watched through their own tears as these two women, superstar and fan, shared a moment of pure connection. When Whitney reached the climactic final chorus, the part where her voice typically soars to impossible heights, she did something unprecedented. She stopped singing and held the microphone to Sarah. "Sing with me, baby," Whitney encouraged. "Let them hear your voice." Sarah hesitated for only a second before opening her mouth and singing the final notes alongside Whitney Houston. Sarah's voice wasn't trained, wasn't perfect, but it was pure and honest and filled with more emotion than technique could ever create. The harmony they created together, Whitney's powerhouse vocals supported by Sarah's earnest voice, was unlike anything anyone in that theater had ever heard. When the song ended, 18,000 people rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted for nearly 10 minutes. But Whitney wasn't focused on the applause. She was holding Sarah in her arms as the girl sobbed against her shoulder, overwhelmed by the experience. What happened after that Radio City Music Hall concert proved that sometimes the real miracles in life don't come from surgical procedures or medical interventions. They come from human connection and the willingness of people to care about someone they've never met. Within 24 hours of the concert, Whitney Houston had mobilized her entire team to make good on her promise to Sarah Jenkins. The television special, when it aired 2 weeks later, included the entire unplanned segment with Sarah. The producers had initially wanted to edit it down, worried that it disrupted the show's pacing. But Whitney insisted they show everything, including her tearful reading of Sarah's letter and the impromptu duet. The broadcast reached 43 million viewers, and by the end of the night, the phone lines at the network were overwhelmed with people wanting to contribute to Sarah's medical fund. "We've never seen anything like this," said Marcus Thompson, the executive producer of the special. "Within 3 days, we had received over $2 million in donations from people all across the country. People were sending $5, $20, $100, whatever they could afford. Everyone wanted to help the blind girl who had touched Whitney Houston's heart. But the financial support was only part of the miracle." Dr. Catherine Morrison, one of the world's leading specialists in Leber's congenital amaurosis, saw the broadcast and immediately contacted Whitney's team. She had been developing an experimental gene therapy treatment that had shown promise in clinical trials, but it was extremely expensive and not covered by insurance. Dr. Morrison offered to perform the procedure on Sarah completely free of charge. "When I saw Sarah's story, I knew she was exactly the kind of patient who might benefit from this treatment," Dr. Morrison explained. "But more than that, I was moved by the sacrifice her mother had made and the compassion Whitney had shown. I wanted to be part of that story." The surgery took place 3 months after the concert at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. It was a 12-hour procedure that involved injecting modified genes directly into Sarah's retinas in an attempt to regenerate the damaged cells. The odds of success were only about 30%, and even if it worked, Sarah might only gain partial vision. But it was hope, and hope was something the Jenkins family had learned to treasure. Whitney Houston flew to Baltimore to be there when Sarah came out of surgery. She sat in the waiting room with Patricia Jenkins for all 12 hours, holding her hand, praying with her, and sharing stories about her own mother. The bond that had formed between them that night at Radio City Music Hall had deepened into genuine friendship. "Whitney told me about her own struggles with her mother's expectations," Patricia shared years later. "She talked about how hard it was to live up to being the voice all the time, how lonely it was at the top. She cried with me about the pressure of always having to be perfect. In that hospital waiting room, she wasn't Whitney Houston, the superstar. She was just a woman who understood what it meant to sacrifice for the people you love." When Dr. Morrison finally emerged from the operating room, she was cautiously optimistic. "The procedure went as well as we could have hoped," she told them. "But we won't know if it worked until we remove the bandages in 2 weeks. Those 14 days were the longest of Sarah's life. She had lived 16 years in complete darkness, and the possibility that she might actually see was almost too overwhelming to contemplate." December 15th, 1994. Johns Hopkins Hospital, Baltimore. The small examination room was crowded with people. Dr. Morrison and her medical team, Patricia Jenkins holding her daughter's hand so tightly her knuckles were white, and Whitney Houston, who had flown in from Los Angeles specifically for this moment. Sarah sat in the examination chair, her head wrapped in surgical bandages that would be removed in the next few minutes. "Sarah, I want you to understand something before we do this," Dr. Morrison said gently. "There's a very good chance that when we remove these bandages, you still won't be able to see. This procedure is experimental, and even in the best-case scenario, your vision might be limited. I don't want you to get your hopes up too high." Sarah nodded, but she was smiling. "Dr. Morrison, I've lived 16 years without seeing anything. Even if this didn't work, I got to sing with Whitney Houston at Radio City Music Hall. I got to hear her tell me she cared about me. I'm already blessed beyond measure." Whitney, standing in the corner of the room, felt tears streaming down her face. This girl's grace and gratitude in the face of possible disappointment was more inspiring than anything she had encountered in her entire career. Dr. Morrison began carefully removing the layers of surgical bandages. Sarah's mother held her breath. Whitney gripped the edge of the counter behind her. The medical staff stood ready with equipment in case Sarah had an adverse reaction. As the final layer of gauze was removed, everyone in the room leaned forward slightly, as if their collective hope could influence the outcome. "Okay, Sarah," Dr. Morrison said softly. "I want you to open your eyes very slowly. The lights in here are dim, but it might still feel overwhelming if the surgery worked." Sarah's eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. For a long moment, she didn't move or speak. Her newly exposed eyes, which were still slightly red from the surgery, moved back and forth as if trying to process completely foreign information. "Sarah?" Patricia whispered, her voice breaking. "Baby, can you see anything?" Sarah's face was impossible to read. She continued looking around the room, her expression confused and overwhelmed. Whitney found herself praying harder than she had ever prayed for anything in her life. "Please, God," she thought. "Please let this work. This girl deserves to see." Then Sarah's eyes stopped moving and focused on something, or someone, directly in front of her. She stared for a long moment, and then her entire face transformed into an expression of pure wonder and joy. "Mama?" she whispered. "Mama, is that you?" Patricia Jenkins broke down completely. "Yes, baby." "Yes, it's me. Can you see me?" Sarah nodded, tears now streaming down her own face. "You're beautiful, Mama. You're so beautiful. Your face is exactly like I imagined it, but better. You have kind eyes." "The kindest eyes I've ever seen!" The room erupted in cheers and tears. Medical staff who had maintained professional composure through thousands of procedures were crying openly. Dr. Morrison was hugging her nurses. Patricia was holding Sarah and sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. And Whitney Houston, the voice that had given Sarah her first glimpse of beauty in a world of darkness, stood frozen in the corner, overwhelmed by the miracle she was witnessing. Then Sarah turned her head and looked directly at Whitney. For a long moment, the two of them just stared at each other. Sarah's eyes, which had never seen a single thing in 16 years, were now taking in the face of the woman whose voice had been her light in the darkness. "Miss Houston," Sarah said, her voice filled with awe. "You're real. You're actually real." Whitney walked over and knelt down beside Sarah's chair, taking the girl's hands in hers. "Hi, Sarah. It's really me." Sarah reached out tentatively and touched Whitney's face, as if confirming that this was truly happening. "Your voice is purple and gold," she said, smiling through her tears. "But your face is warm and kind. Thank you for giving me colors when I had none. And thank you for giving me this." Whitney couldn't speak. She just pulled Sarah into her arms and held her while they both cried. In that hospital room in Baltimore, something transcendent was happening. It wasn't just about restored vision or successful surgery. It was about the power of sacrifice, the strength of compassion, and the way that genuine human connection can create miracles that medical science alone cannot explain. Sarah Jenkins's story didn't end in that hospital room, and neither did Whitney Houston's involvement in her life. In the months and years that followed, a beautiful friendship developed between the superstar and the formerly blind teenager. Whitney became like a second mother to Sarah, calling her regularly, inviting her to concerts, and encouraging her to pursue her own dreams. Sarah's vision, while not perfect, was good enough to change her life completely. She could see her mother's face, watch sunrises, read books, and navigate the world in ways she never had before. But she never forgot the world of sound and color she had built in her darkness. And she never stopped being grateful for the voice that had given her that world. A lot of people asked me after I got my sight back if Whitney's music was different now that I could see her perform, Sarah said in a 2003 interview. The truth is, seeing her was wonderful, but it didn't change what I had already experienced. Her voice had already shown me beauty. My eyes just confirmed what my heart already knew. Sarah went on to study music therapy at Berklee College of Music, dedicating her career to helping other people with disabilities experience healing through sound. She created a program specifically for blind children, teaching them to see music the way she had, to build visual worlds from audio landscapes. Her work has helped hundreds of children find joy and beauty in their circumstances. Whitney established the Sarah's Sight Foundation in 1995, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing funding for experimental vision restoration procedures for children who couldn't otherwise afford them. Over the years, the foundation has helped more than 200 children receive treatments that gave them partial or full vision. Every child who benefited from the foundation received a personal letter from Whitney encouraging them to see the beauty in the world, both with their eyes and with their hearts. The friendship between Whitney and Sarah remained strong until Whitney's death in 2012. Sarah was devastated by the loss of her hero and friend. At Whitney's funeral, Sarah was invited to speak, and her words brought the entire congregation to tears. "Whitney Houston taught me that seeing isn't just about eyes," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her grief. "It's about recognizing beauty in unexpected places. It's about having the courage to stop everything when someone needs you." That night at Radio City Music Hall, Whitney could have just taken my letter, smiled, and continued her show. But instead, she stopped the entire production. "Shared my story with the world and changed my life forever," Sarah continued. "People remember Whitney for her incredible voice, for her music, for her movies. But I remember her for the moment she chose compassion over performance. I remember her for showing me that the greatest gift we can give each other isn't talent or fame or money. It's seeing people, really seeing them, when they need to be seen most." The video of Whitney and Sarah's duet from that 1994 Radio City Music Hall concert has been viewed over 50 million times online. It's used in schools to teach empathy, in churches to illustrate compassion, and in hospitals to remind medical professionals why they chose their careers. That unplanned, unscripted moment has touched more lives than any carefully produced performance ever could. Today, Sarah Jenkins Morrison, now in her 40s, is a renowned music therapist and motivational speaker. She married a wonderful man who shares her passion for helping others, and they have 2 children, both blessed with perfect vision. Sarah still describes sounds and colors, telling her kids that their laughter is bright yellow with sparkles of silver, and that rain sounds like soft gray silk. She keeps a framed photograph in her office, Whitney Houston holding her on stage at Radio City Music Hall, both of them crying, both of them experiencing a moment of perfect human connection. Beneath the photo is a plaque with 7 words that Sarah says changed her understanding of what it means to truly see. "Your voice taught me how to see beauty." This incredible story reminds us that the greatest performances aren't always the ones that are planned and rehearsed. Sometimes they're the moments when we stop the show to acknowledge someone's pain, to celebrate someone's courage, to honor someone's sacrifice. Whitney Houston could have performed "I Will Always Love You" perfectly that night, hit every note flawlessly, and given her audience exactly what they paid for. Instead, she gave them something infinitely more valuable. A reminder that we're all connected, that compassion matters more than perfection, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stop and truly see the person standing in front of us.